You think of ancient Greece and you picture marble statues, philosophy, and democracy. But imagine walking through Athens at dusk, the air sharp with wine and smoke, when you notice something that feels off. A man in his 30s, robed in fine linen, walking with a boy barely into his teens. He isn't hiding. No one whispers. This isn't a scandal. It's celebrated. That's the part history books skim over. The Greeks didn't think of sexuality the way we do. There was no concept of orientation. Instead, there was a hierarchy. If you dominated, you were powerful, masculine, worthy of citizenship. If you submitted, you were lesser, feminized, stripped of honor. And this wasn't abstract philosophy. It was daily life. It was the law. But before we continue, if you're fascinated by the darker sides of forgotten history, consider subscribing and comment where you're watching from. It helps more people find these stories that history tried to bury. Now, back to Athens. The most normalized horror of Greek society was something they called pederasty, literally the love of boys. Not an underground crime, not a shameful vice. It was the cornerstone of elite education, praised in poetry, painted on pottery, protected by law. Men in their 30s systematically pursued boys around 18 to 20. These weren't secret encounters. Families encouraged it. They believed their sons gained social advancement through the patronage of powerful men. The older man, called the Erastes, would court the boy, the Eromenos, with lavish gifts and public gestures, not in shadows, in full daylight, in front of friends and family. Archaeological evidence proves how open it was. Pottery fragments show men and boys in intimate acts, carved into cups used at drinking parties. These weren't hidden away. They sat on dinner tables, in temples and government halls. It was culture, mainstream, normalized, and honored, but the system was carefully controlled. Once a boy's first beard grew in, usually by 18, the relationship ended. Why? Not to protect him, but because continuing would invert the hierarchy. An older man being with a grown youth risked his own status as the dominant one. It was never about love. It was about keeping power clear. The Greeks dressed this up as mentorship. They argued that older men taught younger boys politics, philosophy, and proper conduct. But the sexual bond was considered essential. Philosophers described it as the glue of learning. Without intimacy, they believed, wisdom couldn't pass from one generation to the next. Imagine being that boy, taught to believe this wasn't abuse, it was education. That submitting wasn't humiliation, it was destiny. Refusal meant social failure. Acceptance meant survival. The manipulation was complete. Some modern scholars still argue that these relationships might have been more emotional than physical. But Greek sources erase doubt. Legal codes regulated it. Medical texts described the physical realities. And plays and poems celebrated the sexual aspects openly. It wasn't questioned. It was policy. This wasn't the fringe. This was Athens, Sparta, Corinth. It was the foundation of how Greek elites raised their sons. What today we'd call abuse was then sold as honor. And this is where their golden age truly begins. Not with marble statues, but with boys told that exploitation was education. You've heard the legends of Sparta, the iron discipline, the soldiers who never broke. Children turned into warriors from the moment they could walk, but the stories often skip the details. The hidden methods that forged loyalty through fear, dependence, and silence. At just 7 years old, a Spartan boy was taken from his family. No choice, no protest. He entered the Agog, the state's relentless training program. Comfort stripped away, fed just enough to survive. Beaten into obedience. The purpose wasn't only to make him strong, it was to make him reliant on those above him, and reliance was the weapon. Older warriors, assigned as mentors, controlled every part of a boy's existence: food, warmth, protection, survival itself. Gratitude was twisted into duty. Dependence became a chain. A boy learned that the only way to endure was to submit to the authority that claimed to protect him. Picture the scene. A child in rags, shivering in the cold, hands raw from endless drills. A soldier brings him scraps of food, a thin blanket, and with it, a reminder: loyalty was not a choice. It was a condition for survival. Sparta justified this as essential. They believed bonds forged through dependence made soldiers unshakable in battle. That unity demanded more than discipline. It demanded surrender of the self. Gratitude and fear blurred into one. The system was ruthless. Boys were deliberately underfed, forced to steal to survive, punished not for theft, but for being caught. They slept on reeds, their bodies hardened by cold and pain. Every lesson was a test in endurance and submission. Those chosen by mentors gained a path to survival. Those overlooked were marked as failures. Either way, the boy's life was defined by control. His future as a Spartan depended not on freedom, but on how completely he obeyed. And yet, this wasn't hidden or shameful. It was celebrated, woven into law, song, and legend, praised as the making of men. But beneath the stories of valor stood an entire generation, raised to believe that pain was loyalty, that silence was strength, and that their bodies and wills belonged to the state. The result? Armies so bound together they terrified the world. Warriors who fought with unmatched discipline and ferocity. But at the core of that machine were children shaped not by honor, but by fear. Sparta's greatness wasn't noble. It was engineered, a system that hardened the body while breaking the spirit. Step into an Athenian home. The marble shines. The courtyard fills with chatter. But you won't see the wife. Respectable women were hidden away, confined to private quarters, forbidden to mingle with men outside their families. Her world was walls, silence, and obedience. Marriage wasn't about love. It was a business contract. Fathers arranged deals with men often twice their daughter's age. A man in his 30s, wealthy and established, would marry a girl in her teens. Ownership transferred from father to husband, as if she were livestock or land. Her consent wasn't part of the transaction. Her age didn't matter. What mattered was securing heirs and preserving family wealth. The wedding night? Celebrated as ritual, no matter the girl's fear or youth. The state considered it duty. The man considered it right. Once married, a woman lost nearly everything. She couldn't own property. She couldn't sign contracts. She couldn't speak in court. Her testimony held no legal weight. She was, legally and socially, an extension of her husband's will. If he struck her, confined her, or humiliated her, the law stood with him. Violence wasn't abuse. It was authority. Outside the home, her presence was restricted. No theater, no assembly, no festivals with men present. If she left her quarters, it was with servants, and only for funerals or religious duties. Her voice was cut off from the public world. And even within her own marriage, humiliation was constant. Husbands openly maintained male lovers, concubines, and prostitutes. They could flaunt their affairs without consequence. For wives, jealousy wasn't just forbidden, it was dangerous. A woman who questioned her husband's behavior risked punishment, disgrace, even exile. The double standard was ruthless. If a wife strayed, the penalty was death or permanent exile. For a husband, infidelity was expected, even celebrated as proof of virility. His honor was untouched, hers was destroyed. Meanwhile, women without wealthy husbands were exploited in other ways. Female slaves were purchased for household labor and sexual use, without even the thin protection of marriage. Their children automatically belonged to the master, continuing the cycle of bondage. And then there were the temples. In Corinth, the great temple of Aphrodite kept more than 1,000 women as sacred prostitutes. Families gave up their daughters as offerings, cloaking exploitation in religious devotion. Worshippers came to the temple, convinced their acts were pious. The women had no escape. Their bodies were commodities, funding temple construction and priestly wealth. To outsiders, these arrangements looked like divine service. To the women trapped inside, it was lifelong imprisonment disguised as holiness. Archaeological remains show sprawling complexes, quarters for hundreds of women, baths and offices for record-keeping. It wasn't symbolic. It was industrial. Even those not in temples or slavery lived under constant control. A wife's worth was measured in obedience, fertility, and silence. Her voice had no audience. Her pain had no courtroom. Her life was decided in rooms where she wasn't allowed to speak. When we remember Athens as a cradle of democracy, we forget this. Half its population lived voiceless, hidden, and owned. For every marble column raised in the name of freedom, a woman sat in silence behind a door she couldn't open. Not all control in Greece was open or visible. Some of it hidden ritual. Rituals designed to override consent. Ancient men turned to erotic magic when persuasion or power wasn't enough. Thousands of lead curse tablets have been unearthed, etched with desperate commands. Make her burn for me. Make him leave his wife. Make them obey. The spells were explicit, not poetic. They listed names, acts, and demands in shocking detail. To the Greeks, there was no moral debate. If force, wealth, or law could bend someone's will, why not call on the gods to do the same? Women were targets, not partners. Territory to conquer through fire, ash, and whispered incantations. Magicians offered specialized services. Some wrote charms to seduce unwilling partners. Others crafted curses to break marriages or make rivals sterile. The darkest promised to drive women into uncontrollable lust, stripping them of reason until they submitted. Whether the magic worked didn't matter. The belief itself revealed a culture where sexual coercion was normalized at every level. Legal, social, even supernatural. And then came the slaves, the foundation on which Greek households and city-states ran. Enslaved men and women were property in every sense. Their labor powered the farms, workshops, and mines. Their bodies, too, were tools at their master's disposal. Wealthy families often kept slaves specifically for sexual use. These weren't incidental arrangements. They were planned purchases. Records survive that list slaves by category: household, agricultural, sexual. Children born from these arrangements weren't freed. They became property too, inventory in the next generation's ledger. No law protected them. No court heard their voices. If a slave resisted, punishment ranged from beating to death, all without consequence for the master. Testimony from a slave couldn't even be admitted in court unless obtained under torture, because their word was considered worthless. It was systematic, normalized, and efficient. Every household, every temple, every city benefited from a system where human beings were reduced to flesh for labor and pleasure. The Greeks built philosophy, art, and politics on top of this silence. And the legacy spread. Roman law absorbed Greek sexual hierarchies, codifying them into the empire structure. Later, elements seeped into Christian theology, shaping Western views on gender, sexuality, and authority. The justifications, education, religion, duty, order, echoed long after the practices themselves changed form. That's the chilling part. The brilliance of Greek philosophy existed side by side with the brutalization of women, children, and slaves. They rationalized cruelty with logic, turning violence into virtue. What should have been condemned became celebrated. carved into stone and preserved in literature. Behind the ideals of democracy and reason lay another truth, a society where the powerful claimed absolute rights over the powerless. Athens gave us political theory. Sparta gave us military legend, but together they also gave us a blueprint for exploitation masked as civilization. The next time you hear Greece praised as the golden age of freedom and progress, remember the unmarked voices, the children groomed as students, the women sold as wives, the slaves catalogued as tools, the worshippers tricked into sanctifying abuse. Marble monuments endure, but the human cost was buried beneath them. That is the part of Greece history classes rarely mention. The democracy, the art, the philosophy, all real, but so was the darkness, and both deserve to be remembered.